Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Thank you for a great introduction. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to the culminating part of the 100 best games ever. It's part of our design track. There's 100 games. There's a lot to get through. We'll just go straight into it. Yep. And this will be our next design module going live on the course. So how are we going to categorize what defines a top 100 game? Like, are we going to use revenue, sales numbers, review score? Well, this is a design talk, part of the design track, rather than a business talk. We will look at a few numbers very briefly, but we're all about design learnings and creative opportunities. That's what we're looking for in this talk. So if you look at best-selling video games of the 21st century, it's not so massively surprising. Yeah, you've got your Minecraft, Grand Theft Auto, Wii Sports, Mario Kart, Red Dead Redemption 2, Terraria. I mean, if you were asked to pick the games, you would probably hit about 50% of the games on this list. Yeah, and only when you get down Hogwarts Legacy in at the bottom there with 30 million units, relatively new IP in terms of gaming, very, very big in nearly every other media, but like, it's not a massively surprising list. And when you combine that with revenue, you can see quite a few of the games we're going to look at tonight appear on this list. Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Street Fighter 2, World of Warcraft, those 4 games are on our list. They not only sold and made incredible amounts of revenue, they are incredibly important games in their own right within the kind of the history of games development. And only when you get further down do you start to see games that like don't immediately jump out as games that you really know or really would have played. Okay, but we're gonna review great games and their cultural backdrop and the backdrops that drive an audience to embrace a new experience. And as I said, it's because we're looking at opportunities in the current market. And just as a kind of minor caveat, it will be primarily European focused, or a European looking at the entire world of gaming, because it is my history in a way. And the things that I think really motivate and create a great game, like when you can get into that incredible flow state. A great game is the game that you suddenly look up and you listen and you realize there's loads of birds singing because it's dawn and you've been playing it all night long trying to do some great achievement or defeat some kind of enemy horde or whatever the objective is in the kind of long flow of whatever game you're experiencing. Innovation, we always look for innovation because that's part of the things we look for in the course and part of the way someone at the beginning of their career can launch with something new, interesting and refreshing, because you're not really going to go up against World of Warcraft with your very first game. Yeah, and that kind of creative rebirth I think is really important as well, and we'll see a number of games doing that over the course of this talk tonight. Okay, and then a couple of things, and I might bend this rule slightly, but in general, pick one from a franchise to create diversity on the list. That's what I've done. That's what Matt was asking me to do. So, you know, we won't have Pikmin 1, 2, 3, and 4 taking up 4 slots. It gets 1 slot, even though the other games are just as good and really brilliant. So, introduction over. The best 100 games ever. And we're going to start with number 1. And we've covered this a lot in Module 10. Space War. 1962. MIT. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Steve Russell there in the picture, one of the main people behind this game. You can see the size of the computer this game was done on back in 1962. You can compare the actual game display behind him there and in close there on that image, and you know, just think about how it compares with the computing power you have in the palm of your hand these days. Yeah, but it's still a great game. It's the first game. It's multiplayer. It's also they invented the joystick because people were wanting to play it so much on their kind of lunch hour in the lab that they were wearing out the keyboards. And so, you can play it today there on that link. And there's a lot more detail in Module 10 on this game, but like Space War #1. And then think about the kind of culture around video games and how video games have emerged so incredibly quickly over the last 70, but mainly 50 years. Yeah, in 1975, when Jaws was coming out, and Jaws was the massive summer blockbuster movie that arguably started the summer blockbuster trend that still goes today. And at that time, like in the home, you could play Pong, and in the arcades, they had incredibly simplistic speed race. Both were good, but very, very primitive compared with the technology that was behind things like movies at the same time, which, haven't changed that much in the intervening years. And if you were my age and a kid growing up, 8 years old, when, Jaws came out, you could see it really ripple into the culture, yeah? And literally the year after Jaws, every kid's comic, there was this famous character, Hookjaw, and at the time, there was a kind of a looseness in the IPC comics code, yeah? And this was a comic that I, as an 8-year-old, a 7-year-old, could flick through in the newsagents, in the comic shops, yeah? And it was fantastically nihilistic and super gory. And it just goes to show that, and the people started getting really worried about the cultural impact of this medium, just like they still get worried about the cultural impact of video games now today. So some things are just cycles of different generations getting worried about different pieces of content. Made over different decades. But you can see the gruesomeness of this. And then that filtered in to kind of sci-fi comics with something like 2000 AD. And again, fully brutal, which then met literally months later, probably the biggest impactful cultural event in the late 70s. You had punk in terms of music, and you had Star Wars coming from nowhere, the kind of kicking off the sci-fi fantasy genre. And again, the impact of this film now, Star Wars owned by Disney, there's toys, comics, books, multiple films and TV series, and some would argue that the kind of IP, the franchise, is diluted, and people don't care about it as much as they used to. Back in 1977, in the original film and original trilogy onwards, the kind of cultural impact of these films were just immense, yeah. I had this poster on my wall. I used to stare at the little X-Wings and TIE fighters, and there's a Millennium Falcon in the middle there. I used to draw them on my exercise book. It was just a massive influential thing that then spill into a lot of early games that we're going to see now. And then also, it's interesting to think about how technology has changed over the kind of course of video game history. Late 70s, 1977 onwards, this is Playland. There in that picture is an arcade by the sea in Swanage, Dorset in the UK, and you can see it's literally on the beach, yeah. And it's still there now. I looked it up just last week. It's still there now, but now it's full of kind of slot machines and penny drop machines, and the arcade machines seem to be gone, yeah. But when I, with my brother, was on holiday year after year in this place, we used to come off the beach, sometimes even in our swimming trunks, dripping with seawater. We'd sneak into Playland with a few 10-pence pieces, and we would play all of the arcade games. It was a dark, cavernous space filled with arcade cabinets, and we're going to see some of the greatest games ever made. We played them in this kind of it was like an Aladdin's cave of excitement for us, yeah. And one of the games, the second game on our list, number 2, released in May 1976 and still around in the arcades when we started getting into them, was Breakout by Atari. Kind of the next step on from Pong. You can see it here. There's your bat, and you just can move it left and right, and you hit the ball up into the wall of bricks, and every time you hit one, the ball bounces back. But the incredible thing was the mechanical ball inputs. If you moved your bat fast, you could put backspin on it. You could send it in all different number of ways. And if you were lucky enough to get the ball through the top row here where my cursor is, it would bounce around, destroying all of the bricks until it came back down again. So there was this enormous sense in this game with its incredibly simple graphics of mechanical anticipation. Yeah. And it still inspires people today. And if you look at our second Learning Unreal module, you actually learn to make a very similar game, don't you? The kind of 3D Breakout. And one of the things we're doing right now with one of our first interns is we're turning that into a virtual reality version. Yeah. So that game from 1976 is still inspiring people in 2026. And this is just the very first prototype of our VR version. So you get the idea, yeah? And the core gameplay decades later is, unchanged. It's in VR, it's in 3D, it feels really great because it's a fundamentally interesting mechanic, yeah? And then the next game that would have been in that arcade, and in nearly every arcade, because if you look closely on the list of revenue generation, this is one of the most revenue generating games ever created, is Space Invaders. It was just a brilliant, brilliant game, yeah? And the key things about it that it added on top of a lot of other arcade games at the time was that strategy. Where were you going to try and hang on the left of the screen and take the aliens as they came across? Were you going to move around? It was the first game I ever remembered that had cover points. You could hide your gun unit underneath all the buildings. You could shoot through the buildings, but then also the aliens would shoot down through the buildings as well. And so it was a strange kind of management resource sim. And as you know, each time they went across, they lowered it. They got to the ground, the invasion was complete, and you were dead. And it was an incredibly well realized kind of metaphor of the invasion. Yeah. So, definitely one of the most influential early arcade games ever created. And then, for me, coming from, even at my age, I was always coming from an art background. I loved Galaxian, yeah, which was just 1 year later by Namco, very much in the Space Invaders mold, except the aliens didn't act in a uniform way. They would come down in waves, yeah? And so basically it was like the first time I'd experienced kind of non-player character AI. They seemed really intelligent. They peeled off the main pack, the main kind of formation, and descended towards you, dropping bombs as they went. And, it was, and just compared with the color difference, yeah, it was just outstanding at the time. And then we've covered it loads in module 10, yeah, another incredible arcade game. And only a year later, Pac-Man by Namco, yeah. And we talk about this in depth in module 10. The mechanics are so well realized. The NPC AI, for the time, incredibly advanced. Each one of those 4 coloured ghosts acts in a different way towards the character, creating a real sense of jeopardy, of strategy. And if you do Module 10 and you look at all the videos we've got, you can see how the different strategies and that the risk and reward that you do have in something like Space Invaders is just kind of upped to, like, you know, the nth degree in Pac-Man, yeah. And then also, really, it was one of the first games where the characters became a really important part of the brand. And, you know, you'll still see Pac-Man on T-shirts today. You'll still see the ghosts on mugs and you know, posters. You know, they're really, really, really well-known, really popular characters. And, you know, you can see how that has become a massively important thing in kind of game branding as we've moved forward. And then another one from M10, Defender. Again, we have loads of video analysis of why this is a good game. But if you look, if you haven't done Module 10, if you look, here's the screen, here's the map. It was pretty much the first game that had a world bigger than the screen. And so you were entering a much more exciting space than Galaxian or Space Invaders. Space Invaders, the entire drama takes place on the one screen. In Defender, you're in a bigger world, yeah, and you have to look at the map, see what's going on outside of the screen, and, you know, to really, really address the strategy of, you know, how you're going to save all of the humans, yeah. The art is incredible. Look at the amazing trail on the bullet and the incredibly minimal way that it's given such energy and momentum. And the play, unlike a lot of games from the time, the play is still really exciting today. And then one we talk about a lot in M31, so I won't talk a lot about tonight, is Zork from 1977. It's really the kind of first text-based big quest that, you know, created by Infocom, massively influential, and, like, you know, a load of quest-based games and text games that then came into kind of like point-and-click games that then became kind of RPGs. You know, Zork is the originator of all of that, yeah. And then later, but still in the arcade, by Atari, again, Atari, you know, they used to be such a big, innovative company, is Tempest from 1981. And you can imagine, can't you, walking into a dark arcade and seeing this really cool cabinet. And then this was the game. And it was, there's no other word for it. It was really, really psychedelic, yeah? And, like, you know, the colours, the noise, the music, it was brilliant. And the control scheme was really unique. You had one ball that you could move left or right, which moved your craft, which is on the yellow row, either left or right on whatever the level shape the Tempest was giving you. And you can see here, there's a funnel and here's a different shape. It was one of the first games to have distinct geometric levels. Like, other games had levels that were like different waves of enemies, yeah? So you're in some sort of blank world and the enemies form the structure of the play. Then you had things like Defender, where you were in a world that was bigger than the window you had on it. And so you moved through that world. And then with Tempest, you know, you'd clear a level and then you'd have a new geometric shape for the next level that really would affect the actual way you played the world. This one, if you look on the screen here, you can go all the way around, either left or right, by moving the wheel, yeah? I think on this one, you could go all the way to one end, and you have to come all the way back again, yeah? And the play, if you don't know anything about this game, is the enemies come up from the pit, up the different rows, and you have to destroy them before they get to the top. If they get to the top, they start chasing and moving after you, yeah? And so in a way, although there was no kind of real 3D graphics, and this is only pseudo 3D, it was, again, it was like you had levels, it was three-dimensional. You know, it was an amazing, amazing game at the time. And they made versions all the way up to Tempest 2000, didn't they? You know, it's a very, very popular game. And then In the same year, it's interesting to think about the speed of some of these developments and these innovations and how quickly things were changing. In the same year, Donkey Kong from Nintendo, yeah? The graphics, do the graphics look amazing now? No, but it was one of the first platform games. It was the first game to feature Mario. It was Miyamoto's first game. And Nintendo actually had released a game before that was a really big flop. So they had loads of spare cabinets. And Miyamoto was a relatively junior member of staff on his first design gig. And he was asked to hey, can you make a game that can fit into all these empty cabinets that we haven't been able to solve yet? And he tried to get Popeye, the license to the American cartoon Popeye with Olive Oil and Bluto. And so Mario would have been Popeye, and Donkey Kong would have been Bluto, and Princess Peaches would have been Olive Oil. But that fell through, so they made their own characters and created an enormously rich new narrative and world, which spawned loads of Donkey Kong games and loads of Mario games. Fantastic game, and it was really, really fun. And then all these things were happening at the same time. You got Clash of Titans, big film in the summer, Raiders of the Lost Ark, big Spielberg film, and some of those films again. Games were created with similar themes and ideas much later on. So the small kids that watched these movies with their parents at the cinema, they became the adults that made really unique and interestingly themed games that were very influenced by these things. And then another one, we talk about this a lot in M16, Robotron. Again by Williams, who did Defender. And it's a great game, and it's that the first of that big genre that's really typified by something like Vampire Survivors, where you're constantly under threat, the kind of wave shooter, and again we analysed that for its incredible use of AI and logic to make a really compelling adrenaline-filled experience.